With YouTube attacking alternative media, please consider supporting the channel via Patreon for just $1 per month. Link below. Last year there was a whole James Damore situation, right? Guy releases the Google memo, the progressive media picks up on it, and they're just like, tech bro, and there's all sexist stuff, and then they ended up using it as a reason to get rid of him, and James Damore filed a lawsuit for discrimination, but ended up basically losing that, at least with the Labor Review Board, simply because they tried arguing that the potential of him saying things that would make people upset was enough for Google to fire him. Really makes you look at the way the country operates in terms of people's opinions and everything else, considering that he was trying to help and he got screwed over in the process. But here we're finding out that there's another ex-Google engineer who was fired for being too liberal. Now, I'm not going to lie. When I first saw the headline, my thought was, say what? That doesn't make any sense to me. But apparently, Tim Chevalier sues Google, claims only employees who represent the majority speak. Which, well, we've seen this in regressive circles. It's the echo chamber. They don't care at all about getting anything else done. They just want to maintain that echo chamber. And it happens in all forms of politics, absolutely. But it feels really bad on the left because they just do it in ways where you're like, God, that's so scummy. Anyway. It says here that an ex-Google engineer has sued his former employer, claiming that he was wrongfully terminated as a result of expressing his politically liberal opinions, which included opposing harassment and white supremacy on internal message boards. I think at this point, I just want to say, for one, it's safe to say that you should probably never use internal message boards, right? You should never really use the internal mail or the internal internet if you work at one of these tech companies, because it's never going to end well in your favor. Now, according to the lawsuit, which was filed Wednesday in the state of court in San Francisco, Tim Chevalier, probably mispronounced that, I do apologize, served as a site reliability engineer from 2015 until November 2017. Chevalier, who identifies himself as disabled, queer, and transgender man, routinely spoke out in favor of minority and traditional underprivileged rights, in particular to counter the opinions offered up by another then-colleague, James Damore. So this is okay. This is the thing. So this person, Tim Chevalier, is a disabled, queer, and transgender man. So let's just, if you think about it in terms of just the regressive stack, is check those boxes, right? Just check those boxes. This is the type of person that Google really just gets wet at the lips for. I'm talking like salivates through their panties for. This is the type of person that they want to fill the diversity and inclusion quota. This is what they're hoping for. And they fired this person for being too liberal. It's entirely possible that just based, upon the culture that's created there, that if they are the minority, and when you have the minority, they usually get ostracized because they don't fit in that tiny little box of inclusion that the minority has built for themselves, i.e. their own echo chamber. Now, last year, among many other statements in his lengthy memo, Damore argued that the preferences and abilities of men and women differ in part due to biological causes, and that these differences may explain why we don't see equal representation in women in tech and leadership. In August 2017, Damore was fired from Google, and he recently lost his filing with the National Labor Relations Board. And the thing is, what Damore was doing here, what he was arguing for, believe it or not, and this is what never gets covered, he was arguing for diversity. He was arguing for inclusion. He was arguing for ways to Google to essentially figure these things out in order to make the hiring process a lot better. Because ultimately what he was saying was that there's 20% of the hires there were female, and that kind of goes in line with 20% of the computer sciences degrees that go out being female. So Google was hiring in line with the rate of degrees that were being given out at universities, probably around the world and whatnot, just a general overall statistic. And he wanted to find ways to make this work, and that's what he did. He ultimately was trying to argue for a more diverse and inclusive environment to bring in more of these people. But because of the way that the memo was received, and because of the way that the memo was pushed due to the regressive media, they treated him like he was literally Hitler. Now, by contrast, in September 2016, Chevalier wrote, "In a culture where it's common to respond to diversity initiatives with 'we can't lower the bar,' implying a baseline assumption that women, non-binary people, and men of color are incompetent, it's equally important that we don't do the reverse, that we don't insist on white male competence even in the face of clear evidence to the contrary." Now, not long after when Chevalier's newly assigned manager, Peter Dahl, criticized his subordinates for too much social activism, despite the fact that Chevalier was rewarded with multiple peer bonuses for his internal commentary. So essentially what you have here is Peter Dahl is criticizing the too much social activism, but in reality, the people that were there were on board with it. So Chevalier was going off and being super lefty, but his boss was like not super into it. That's kind of what I'm getting here. Now, however, as months passed and a friction continued between himself and his superiors, Chevalier also believed that others, including human resource official, were dismissive of his remarks and critiques, which ultimately led to his dismissal. Now, the lawsuit continues on by saying, though Chevalier's conversations with his manager in human resources, he learned that Google defines appropriate workplace speech by the standard of what someone with a cisgender, heterosexual, white male, upper middle class background would say. In truth, Google's promise to allow its employees to freely speak their minds only applies to people who represent the majority viewpoint and use the majority rhetoric. But if that was true, then James Damore wouldn't have been fired. James Damore, a man who is a string bean, who looks like he is 90 pounds soaking wet, probably spoke to quite a bit here of what Chevalier is complaining about, and yet was ultimately fired. Ultimately fired for sharing a document trying to fight for diversity and inclusivity in terms of hiring inside of Google and how to make it a better place. Whereas he was actually sent death threats from other employees, which is why he didn't go into work after the memo broke and went viral. And those employees, at least one in particular, was given a slap on the wrist while he was terminated and basically run through the PR ringer of the social tech blog community, which then moved over to the social regressive blogs we find online. And here we've got a person who's probably a bit more of a lefty than people like, complaining that Google is like, maybe some of your language wasn't really the best. Now, Google spokeswoman Gina Scigliano says that a lively debate is an important part of company culture, apparently unless you are Tim Chevalier or James Damore. She goes on to say, but like any workplace, it doesn't mean anything goes. All employees acknowledge our code of conduct and other workplace policies, under which promoting harmful stereotypes based on race or gender is prohibited. This is a very standard expectation that most employees have on their employers, or most employers have on their employees. The overwhelming majority of our employees communicate in a way that is consistent with our policies. But when an employee does not, it is something we must take seriously. We will always make our decision without any regard to the employee's views. Now, the update here says, in the original version of the story, ours inaccurately described Damore's memo in a brief one-sentence summary. For clarity, they've updated it. And that's good. At least they've gone trying to update it there, even though they probably don't agree with what James Damore said. Even though at the speech I was at with Damore, evolutionary biologists broke it down what he was trying to say, and you're like, oh yeah, I get it. Because when someone with a science degree actually looks at what he says, and not someone with a bachelor's in communications can decipher what Damore is up to, and then we can get it. But we ultimately look at this particular story here, and we can kind of come to the realization that Google definitely likes an echo chamber, but they don't like you to go outside of the echo chamber. And that's kind of what I feel like Tim here was up to. Tim was walking around and using language that was probably pretty salty. A lot of the pejoratives and things like that we see online that might be relatively normal on Twitter and other particular blogs, but that might not have actually gone over well inside of Google. And the way I'm kind of take this whole thing is that Tim was probably warned a couple times about this, was definitely told this is not a good idea, and probably didn't care, thinking that, oh, well, I'm talking about the types of issues that Google wants. I'm talking about the type of issues that Google cares about, but I'm not doing it in the way that they want, and therefore I'm now the victim. I don't know if I feel bad for Tim. I feel bad for James, obviously, because this dude is literally trying to help, where it feels like Tim was trying to be the alpha of the regressive, so to speak, using that really over-the-top salty language in order to strike down the patriarchy and everything else, which seems to be kind of a thing when you look at a lot of the crazy, more out there social activists, right? They have to be as loud and as boorish as humanly possible in order to maintain the attention of their peers. And ultimately, that's not what happened here. So I'll be curious to see how this entire thing plays out, mostly due to the fact that we're looking at this almost from like it's not, I don't know if I want to call it like the opposite side of the same coin as Damore. It feels in line with everything. It does. It feels in line with the entire situation. But what we see here is a person who was using what appears to be kind of salty language, right? Maybe inappropriate workplace language, and then is arguing that that their freedom of speech was being hindered by Google. And this is where it might come down to that type of argument where Tim's saying I was using language that I felt was appropriate, that I felt was in line with my character. Google has kind of a speak freely, program here. But at the same time, Google can come back with, well, yeah, your First Amendment rights apply to you not being busted by the government, but here we do have standards. And that's kind of what the Google spokesperson was saying. Like this person was Tim was using a lot of language that they don't approve of, and targeting race and gender. Now, the thing is, though, unless we know what that is, we don't know exactly who or what Tim was talking about, which I do feel if that information was presented, if we had access to that, we'd be able to then see precisely where Tim's opinions are. Based upon the lawsuit, we get a general idea, and I get a general idea of probably what Tim was saying. But just for the sake of clarity and for the sake of information, I would like to see them myself.